How do we look at this painting within the oeuvre of Renoir? Does it reflect his interests of the time or lead to additional routes of exploration? I think the answer is a little bit of yes and no. As the copyist, the artist hewed pretty closely to the original. And while it's believed that actually he would have rather done a copy of The Women of Algiers, I do think that this painting, in its emphasis on a rite, on a celebratory moment, on music and dance, fulfills, or maybe better yet, stands as a testimony to the long-standing interests of Renoir, not only in this moment of the 1870s, but later on. It's really a delight to discover this painting. It's not one that I really knew very well, and there's not a lot of literature on this painting, and we'll probably see a little bit why that is. In 1875, Pierre-Auguste Renoir received a commission to paint the Jewish wedding in Morocco. He probably needed it financially, but he might have also needed it aesthetically, as we will explore. Always keen to underscore his start as a member of the working classes, he noted of his earliest days, quote, "Not having rich parents and wanting to be a painter began by way of crafts, porcelain, faience, blinds, paintings in cafes." Of course, by paintings in cafes, he was referring to iconic works such as La Grenouillère, absolute monuments of the burgeoning aesthetic movement that we now call Impressionism. And while he didn't say it, he probably also meant paintings of Paris, like the Pont des Arts. He also spent time painting portraits of friends like Basile and Monet, for whom he likely did the same favor, and for patrons. The latter, in particular, helped to pay his bills. The year before the commission, Renoir had shown 6 paintings at a groundbreaking exhibition held in the Parisian studio of the photographer Nadar. We now call this 1874 epochal show the first Impressionist exhibition. And this was the first of 8 such shows held between 1874 and 1886. This is when the Impressionists burst onto the scene. While many of his fellow painters who debuted their works alongside Renoir earned the incredulity and scorn of the critics, as new aesthetic developments often can, Renoir's reviews were much more favorable. Like a great many works in the exhibition by other artists, his Dancer was critiqued for its sketchy quality and its apparent absence of line. But one writer more positively remarked, "The danseuse is true to life and has a fine and nervous elegance in its truth." Another commented and described the dancer's head as fresh, alive, with a very simple modeling and a very accurate bearing. La Loge, also titled L'Avant-Scène, with its sparkling satins and gauzy laces, also debuted at this first Impressionist outing, and served as a manifesto painting of sorts for Renoir and for the painters of his generation. Renoir captured the fascination with costume, and for some of you may know, this was the subject of a fairly recent and unbelievably gorgeous exhibition at the Metropolitan, the Art Institute of Chicago, and the Musée d'Orsay. Additionally, this painting represented the first work by the Impressionists devoted to the spectacular society of the theater, in itself a kind of microcosm for the new optics of a world of photography and other image making, a world of those who gazed and who were gazed upon. Certainly, this subject became a regular theme for artists such as Marie Cassatt and especially Edgar Degas. With such positive encouragement, Renoir painted a second, smaller version of La Loge, which he offered at auction in March 1875. And the work quickly found an owner in Jean Dollfus, an Alsatian industrialist, specifically a textile manufacturer, who eventually became a financial advisor to Napoleon III. And this is him now in almost 3 dimensions, frontally and then from the side. In Mulhouse, the home to his factories, and in Paris, Dollfus championed social welfare programs for the working classes. He had established the very first cité ouvrière, or houses with gardens, which could be bought at cost by workers. It's pretty radical for the time. He wrote tracts about child labor and worker safety, and he also helped to establish libraries and factories. One might imagine that Renoir would have appreciated such a progressive attitude towards working people, especially since he grew up in the home of a tailor and a seamstress, so the textiles were the perfect match. I should say that the company that Dollfus, that his family owned, it still exists. It's called Dollfus Meag and Company, and DMC are its initials. You can still buy their products. Dollfus assembled an important collection of paintings, tapestries, netsuke, decorative arts, medals, and the list continues. So extensive was his collection that 5 or 6 posthumous sales were held to disperse the various sub-collections. In his painting taste, Dollfus had embraced the kinds of mid-19th century painting that foretold the Impressionists, painters such as Corot, Daubigny, and Millet. And this is an image of one of the workers' housings. And it was Dollfus who offered Renoir the alluring commission to paint a copy of The Jewish Wedding in Morocco, a work by Eugène Delacroix that first debuted at the Salon of 1841. And this is that painting. The painting had been transferred in 1874 from the Luxembourg, the home for contemporary art, to the Louvre, where the revered masters resided. Auction catalogs suggest that Dollfus particularly esteemed the work of Delacroix. He owned a great many works by the artist. In this monumental work, Delacroix recreated a scene he had witnessed while traveling as official artist in the retinue of Comte Charles de Mornay, Louis Philippe's special envoy to the Sultan of Morocco in 1832. While he painted the Sultan and his entourage, the kind of formal or ceremonial image that was expected to memorialize the event, Delacroix appeared to find far more inspiration in the sights and peoples of North Africa. He sketched from the moment he made landfall, filling 7 albums with drawings and watercolors. He said that he wished he had 20 arms and 48 hours in the day, so he could sketch as much as he wanted. And some of his most important works came out of this trip, including The Women of Algiers and The Jewish Wedding in Morocco. The first work originated, The Jewish Wedding in Morocco, first originated as a commission from the Marquis de Maison in 1837. Now, while he was in Morocco, Delacroix had the help of a Jewish merchant from Tangiers as his designated translator. And that meant that Delacroix had access to the intricacies and rituals of daily life in the region. And this Jewish wedding was the kind of event he would have relished. They frequently lasted over a period of days, even up to 2 weeks. You can only imagine how that killed the bride's father. But it left him ample time to do a lot of sketching. And in his accounts of his travels, Delacroix suggests that he had been witness to many such events. This is a very highly finished sketch of the bride. And he seemed to delight in her quote-unquote handsome looks, as he put it, and her extravagant costume, which he described as most picturesque. At Jewish weddings, he notes homes filled with immense crowds, dancing, and dancing, which to the French would have been seen as the height of bad taste, or the kind of dancing. Music, which to his ear sounded simultaneously inharmonious and monotonous. And if he found the event overwhelming, as others who witnessed such rites did, he painted an exotic but orderly scene. In the brochure for the 1840 Salon at which the painting first appeared in public, we are told that the bride, the star of the show, as we all know, remains out of sight in the interior of the domicile, while a mixed company of Jews and Muslims celebrate in other quarters of the home, including this courtyard. We're told that the Muslims pay the musicians to play and sing, and the women take turns dancing before an assembled crowd. Delacroix has arranged the musicians on carpets against the back wall of this courtyard, and they include a violin player who holds his instrument in his lap, a man who plays a Moorish guitar, and a tambourine player. So this is the violin player. So you can see this is his instrument and bow, the guitar player, and then the man with the tambourine. The dancer emerges from the left, and she uses a scarf as a prop, moving it in a sinuous motion, the echo of her dance, which primarily involves twisting her lower body. So I sort of imagine this to be a little bit like a belly dance. As Clara Brahm notes in a 1952 article on the painting, Delacroix makes nearly symmetrical what would have been fairly typically asymmetrical spaces of a Moroccan home. And this is the sketch that Delacroix did of the space. And I think you can see that the space is sort of in a regular shape. It's not a clear rectangle. And he also eliminates this little pillar here that you see to the left. She opines that this strategy provides a kind of regularizing calm to a scene that he had found overbearing. Or which just made him uneasy. Similarly, she notes that though he described an enormous crowd, people, you kind of had to shove them out of the way to get through, the people are distributed pretty evenly in the shade of the parapets. Although the crowd consisted of a mix of Muslims and Jews, Delacroix rigorously adhered to the dress habits of the region. The Muslims are generally turbaned and wear brightly colored clothing and slippers, often yellow slippers. The Jewish men, in compliance with Moroccan law, wear much darker colors, black or dark blues, and they wear reddish-brown belts, black slippers, and skull caps or yarmulkes. Delacroix deploys these contrasts to create a rhythmic arrangement of the participants. So you can see he kind of alternates the various members of the group. There'll be a Muslim woman, then a Jewish man, then a Muslim woman, so that there's a little bit of a rhythm, a visual kind of rhythm to the picture. When this work was displayed at the Salon of 1841, it met with great enthusiasm, with praise offered for its color and dynamism, the areas where Delacroix always scored very high. But critics could always find things to disparage with the finish and the lack of drawing, again, areas where Delacroix always seemed to irritate. As an example, a critic called Peloton wrote, "The arrangement of light and of the groups is of a striking originality. The dancing woman displays an agreeable movement. But unfortunately, when one approaches and examines the figures close up, the lines fade and vanish." Another complained that the work looked very good from a distance, but close up, quote, "all becomes confused and vague, and the eye is distracted by small red, yellow, or blue brushstrokes distributed as if by hazard and in a million different directions." Ultimately, one critic declared, "We believe that the painting of the Jewish wedding will have contributed more than all other to reconcile Monsieur Delacroix's most passionate detractors. The painting has such a magic effect that it is impossible even for the opposition not to let themselves be seduced." Though the Marquis de Maison had lost interest in the project by the time Delacroix finished the painting, the kind of client you want to kill, and he refused to pay for it, the Duc d'Orléans, the son of Louis Philippe, who was already mad for Delacroix, acquired the painting and ultimately gave it to the Luxembourg. In 1855, when France wished to crow about its achievements in the realm of art, a new building went up on the Avenue Montaigne to display works by some of the most important of her artists, including Delacroix, who showed a few dozen paintings, including The Women of Algiers, which I showed you before, and The Jewish Wedding. The painting, even 15 years later, still seemed to split critics, with Maxime Ducamp remarking that the colors were soapy and disagreeable. Not something I really see. Soapy to me means foamy or something. And on the other hand, Théophile Gautier noted, the colors of this painting are sober, languid, and tranquil, and they suggest that the chalk white terraces outside are scorched by a blinding and merciless sun. While the commission of another artist's work might have been somewhat unusual for someone in the soon-to-be ascendant Impressionist school, a group that prided itself on painting before a motif and its realism, Renoir seems to have embraced the project. And it also seems odd that he would have done this, particularly in the 1870s, because at that time, Orientalism was derided for its exacting detail in service to fantasy or escapism. So this is a kind of Orientalism that, by Gérôme, that was very popular, or had been very popular. It was the kind of work that the Impressionists and other avant-garde painters were really railing against, because it was just too precise, too perfect, and not really of the moment in which they were living. So this was the kind of work that they were rejecting. Now, for Renoir, he really embraced the project because he had spent hours in the Louvre studying and copying the works of his predecessors. He had grown up just a few blocks away and likely began visiting at a very young age. After 1855, it was open daily to the public and it was free. While some followers of realism had called the Louvre a graveyard of art to be burned to the ground, he spent hours there. Monet also cajoled Renoir about his devotion to the Louvre, but the painter proudly asserted that he continued to visit the museum regularly until his rheumatism prevented such outings, and that would have been sometime around 1910 or 11. So he would have been already 70 years old. And the Louvre was not like it is today. No pyramid to walk in, no elevators, big stairs. So it was quite a thing to get through. He said, as long as I was able to walk, there was nothing I liked better than to stroll around the rooms at the Louvre. I know of nothing more restful. Here, on every wall, I could find old friends with whom I loved to linger and in whom I was always discovering new wonders. Indeed, he concluded that the Louvre is the best teacher. And who can argue with that? Even before he enrolled in the studio of Gleyre and at the École des Beaux-Arts for formal training, he obtained a copyist card at the Louvre in 1862. If you wanted to sketch, just to draw, you could do that. But if you wanted to paint, you had to have this card. There, he learned from the facility of his predecessors, Rubens, Watteau, Fragonard, and Boucher. Often described as the painter of conviviality and happiness, it's little surprise that Renoir loved those artists and that they had a profound effect on his work. But he also found in their paintings a willingness to flout the rules and to keep their work fresh. He was also greatly drawn to Delacroix, whose works often addressed the dark and the dangerous, which is, sort of not what you think about with Renoir. For him, Delacroix was the man with sun in his head and storms in his heart. But Renoir found common aesthetic cause in Delacroix's interest in decorative programs, in figure painting, in their actual paint handling, and in their reverence for color. As Christopher Riopel and Patrick Noon have shown, some notable collectors, such as Victor Choquet, clearly saw Renoir as an heir to Delacroix's mantle. And this is Monsieur and Madame Victor Choquet. Choquet was a fairly low-ranking customs officer with very modest means, but he managed to acquire an unbelievable collection. He's best known for his collections, or for his works, for his holdings of works by Cézanne, Corot, Courbet, Delacroix, Manet, Monet, Morisot, and Renoir. Not bad for a civil servant. After meeting Renoir at an auction of Impressionist works, Choquet asked Renoir to do a portrait of his wife, Augustine, there on the left. Though the painter regarded portraiture as something of a palate cleanser, he said, "It's good to do something boring from time to time." The commission was interesting in some ways because it came with a stipulation. Renoir had to paint Choquet's wife with a picture of Delacroix behind her. He said, "I want to see you together, you and Delacroix." And it's a little unclear what painting is behind her, but behind him, there is a study from his Hercules cycle from the Salon de la Paix at the Hôtel de la Ville in Paris. And I think you can see it there. Behind her, I'm just going to go back one, it may also be a study because in that space there were very irregularly shaped spaces for painting, but I haven't been able to figure out which one that is. But there is an anecdote that, that Choquet wanted to buy a very particular Delacroix that was very expensive, and he had to really convince his wife to do it, and she agreed, so he bought her a ring, which she's wearing. And so painting her with her jewelry was meant to flatter her. Neither the Choquet portraits nor the Jewish wedding were Renoir's first engagements with the legacy of Delacroix. And while we do not tend to think of Renoir as an Orientalist in this period of the 1870s, we think of him instead as really a painter who offered us a certain kind of Frenchness in his scenes of countryside and café-concert. But he had already made two paintings that responded to the North African work of his predecessor. In 1870, he painted a portrait of Madame Clementine Valency-Stora, the wife of an antiques merchant who was acquainted with Renoir. She was a Jew from northern Africa whose family immigrated to France to escape burgeoning anti-Semitism. And in this painting, where she looks pretty unhappy, I would say, she wears what is authentic Algerian garb. And Renoir really appeals to revel in the opportunity to paint the rich colors and textures, much as he seemed to do in the painting of La Loge. So you can see why he would have been attracted to this costume. And it's not very clear whether this was his suggestion or her suggestion. There does seem to be another painting of her wearing such costume. Not by Renoir, though. Although it's an appropriate costume for her, given her roots, it feels a bit odd, as though she is playing a kind of fancy dress. Or perhaps because it reminds us of previous vogues for exoticism in portraiture in which female sitters, and sometimes male ones too, dressed in what was called Oriental costume. And I give you an example here. This is by Lyotard. It's from the mid-18th century, and it's Marie Adelaide of France, so she was the daughter of Louis XV, in what was called Turkish costume. And this was a way of often painting the aristocracy in these get-ups. They could also dress as goddesses or shepherdesses. You know, wearing these kinds of costumes was a way to be depicted, but Oriental costume was a popular one. In the same year, Renoir painted this very odd odalisque, which also appear to take inspiration from the women of Algiers, which I show you here, and in particular, the figure on the far left. So slightly different position, but again, that incredible richness of color and texture, gauzy materials, more silken, shiny ones. And then, of course, all of the environs, which would have been appealing to him. And finally, he made an attempt at his own women of Algeria with a painting called Parisian Women in Algerian Costume, which is here on the right. He purportedly did not like this painting very much, and I can see why. He felt it was pretty unsuccessful, and he quickly disposed of it through a sale. But in all of these instances, it's all a case of fancy dress. He is not in the environment. He is not painting people of North Africa. They're all Parisians dressing up. With the commission of the Jewish wedding, this time a copy rather than a painting inspired by, Renoir had another chance to explore the mastery of Delacroix. I should mention that there's one other small copy of the Jewish wedding, and it was painted by this man, Louis de Planay. He was a student of Delacroix, and Delacroix asked him to paint a much smaller version of the painting to be sent out for printed versions of the painting. So whether it was mezzotint or lithograph, that's what the smaller reduction was for. And in that case, Delacroix supervised, probably standing over the shoulder, as we hear from Louis de Planay, the exact kinds of pigments he was supposed to use, the underlayers of painting, all of that. I couldn't find an image of it. It remained in Delacroix's studio until he died, and then it was sold in a posthumous sale, and it was bought by one of his relatives, and I believe it remains in that family. In the case of Renoir's painting, he kept the original dimensions, which I think it's about 43 high by 57 inches wide. So essentially the same monumental dimensions. And side by side, the painting appears incredibly faithful to the work by Delacroix. However, the palette appears in the bright jewel-like tones that we have come to associate with Impressionism. Intriguingly, one critic of Renoir described his work in 1883 in somewhat disparaging terms as the blonde version of Delacroix. And actually, that is pretty true. It's a much brighter, lighter quality. Well, as I say, it was intended as a really derogatory comparison, but it does get at a sense of the kind of light that Renoir and his fellow Impressionists were after. And what we see is a brightened palette overall, a sense of uniform sparkle to the ensemble, the architecture, the costumes, the light. It's said that Delacroix described the women on the left as being arranged like potted flowers. And you sort of have that sense in the Renoir version because it's a much brighter picture. That said, the dark colors, the blues and blacks of the costumes of the Jews would have appealed to Renoir, Clara Brahm notes, because he was one of the few Impressionists to use black. And he called it the Queen of Colors. He later abandons black, but in these early paintings you see it quite a bit. So that was one case where he sort of probably embraced the darker tone. If the environs seem a bit grimier in the Delacroix, and it's a little bit hard to know without seeing the picture in person, cleaning up the scene in general would have been in keeping with Renoir's general approach to his Impressionist subjects, preferring to elide the difficult and the unseemly in favor of the joyful and the pretty. And I should say about the painting on the left, people have noted that that the paint has darkened over time, and I'm really not sure of the state of the varnish, so sort of that overall sort of yellow quality could just be the aging of the painting, but it could have also been part of the sense of creating an atmosphere. So how do we look at this painting within the oeuvre of Renoir? Does it reflect his interests of the time or lead to additional routes of exploration? I think the answer is a little bit of yes and no. As the copyist, the artist hewed pretty closely to the original. And while it's believed that actually he would have rather done a copy of the Women of Algiers, I do think that this painting, in its emphasis on a rite, on a celebratory moment, on music and dance, fulfills, or maybe better yet, stands as a testimony to the long-standing interests of Renoir, not only in this moment of the 1870s, but later on. For example, in 1876, Renoir presented the dance at the Moulin de la Galette at the third Impressionist exhibition in 1877. And this is one of the most important paintings of these Impressionist exhibitions. This latter painting captures a scene at one of the café concerts of Montmartre. Robert Herbert has described this venue and its activities as, quote, an old-fashioned Sunday dance for the residents of the neighborhood. So much like the Jewish wedding, just the people who happen to live in the neighborhood, friends, residents of the area. And in its own way, a dance at the Moulin de la Galette, also a daytime dance in an enclosed courtyard with musicians at the back, was something of a rite. Of course, this event served to introduce and forge bonds between men and women, perhaps with the ultimate goal of marriage. Apart from the subject matter itself, the patterning of light and dark found in the original work by Delacroix and the copy by Renoir finds echo in the signature light dappling and the painting of the light clothing of the women matched with the darker costumes of the men. Now, Renoir did actually go to Algeria in the early 1880s. He, after struggling through the 1870s, in the 1880s, he was rich, or he was getting there anyway. So he had money to spend, and he went to Algeria in 1881 and 82. And unlike Monet and Degas, who had traveled very, very broadly, Renoir had never been out of the country. So this trip was very, very intrepid for this artist. He had already been, he had been venturing outside of Paris and outside of Normandy when he would go down to the Mediterranean coast. So he was getting closer there. And finally he went. The scene on the left is called Arab Festival. It's a work originally that was owned by Monet. Renoir paints crowds of people in the ruins of Turkish fortifications gathered around a small band of musicians. And as several scholars have noted, this was a kind of painting before the motif that offered a new approach to the Orientalist endeavor. So he was capturing a sense of the exotic, but he was painting it on the scene. What's interesting about it is a very unusual view for Renoir. We're quite far away. And we're both above looking down and also looking up. So it's a very unusual viewpoint for him. Similarly, he provided a view of a mosque, a scene, it's a fairly important mosque, and rendered in the earth tones of Algiers rather than the lusher hues of France. So again, he's stretching himself with his palette. And then finally, he did this landscape, this lush image of a banana field in Hama, and it gave him the opportunity for a bravura display of brushwork. During these trips, he also painted figural scenes or portraits. This is one of a seated Algerian woman, dated 1882, and he had a very hard time convincing Algerians to pose for him. So they wouldn't sit. They were very reluctant to do this. So often what he had to do was find French nationals who lived in Algeria and dress them up. So you can see that here. Sometimes he would darken their hair so that they would look as though they were from North Africa. So here, this Algerian girl. And then this really beautiful work, this is at the Clark. It's called Mademoiselle Fleury in Algerian costume, or sometimes it's called Girl with a Bird. But again, here too, he's dressing up his sitter, not really finding, as Delacroix did maybe somewhat surreptitiously, the opportunity to sketch people in their own, within their own carrying about in their daily life. He was always at a distance for those scenes. And although these are closer up, you have more of a sense of fancy dress. And that perhaps it's not as accurate as it might be. And also the other thing to say is with this one in particular, Mademoiselle Fleury, it's been pointed out that the girl holding the bird is a fairly typical French subject. And so in that regard, there's not much of a departure. It's something that a French clientele would have expected to see, but then somewhat dressed up. But he did continue and return to the subject matter of the Jewish wedding in some ways. It always remained with him, and these are the last two pictures that I'll show you. This is Dancing Girl with Tambourine and Dancing Girl with Castanets. These are from 1909. So now we're at 30 years plus since he painted the Jewish wedding. And you can practically see these two women as figures from the dancing women within the scene of the Jewish wedding. So it clearly remained with him, and he, throughout his life, seemed to be working out his own relationship with Delacroix. These two panels were actually decoration for the home of a major collector called Maurice Gagnat, and in that way, too, in painting decorations, he was evoking his hero, Delacroix. But ultimately, this was, as my now successor at the Barnes would say, a woman called Sylvie Patry, who is a great Renoir expert, that these were really the culmination of his dialogue with Delacroix. And he maintained a 40-year or 30-year interest in returning to these subject matters and learning to paint with the color of Delacroix. And with that, I will thank you.
How did the Jewish wedding come into the Lamb collection?
So after Dollfus died, his collection went on sale, posthumous sale, as often happened. And I believe from there it was bought by a dealer. And then it was sold to a collector, I want to say in Minneapolis. And then he sold it, and it was purchased by Worcester in 1943. Is that right? Sweet.
I'm interested to know, most of the profile that you show women as part of the painting. Mm-hmm. What happened with the men's?
Well, it's interesting you ask that. I mean, typically, people prefer images of women. I mean, they're the tradition of paint.
I know that you're beautiful.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, just as like a side note, I mean, as at auction, portraits of women always sell a little bit better than portraits of men. Sorry. But I think that has to do a lot with costume and the sort of deluxe nature of the costume, and where men's clothing usually is more sober. But I think, remembering that these are male patrons for the most part who are commissioning the works, they typically prefer to have female subjects.
Would that comment, do you think, be attributed to the fact that most of the painters were men and they just had less interest in painting other men?
Oh, well, I mean, I think there's certainly, yeah, I mean, I'm sure there's some truth to that. I mean, it's interesting because there's a switch. I mean, in the 18th century, one of the standards of painting is to paint the male body and the nude male body. First of all, because it's proper, not, to have access to the nude male body wasn't as scandalous as painting the female body, and that switch is in the 19th century. I think, as mentioned, and for those of you who have studied Impressionism, and particularly works of Degas in particular, there's always this sort of spectacular notion of seeing the woman's body, whether it's behind stage at the theater or bathing or dressing. It has a very long tradition even before in Old Master painting, Susanna at the Bath and other kinds of things where there's the veneer of narrative, so that you can gaze upon the female body. But I think for a long time certainly it was improper for men to paint the female nude.
You said Delacroix's palette was sun and storm. Is he recognized for those colors on his palette, and did Renoir really capture that sun and storm palette in these final pictures?
I think it was more a sense of his palette, but also his spirit, that he had a kind of a stormy spirit. And when you think about a lot of his works, there are a lot of violent works in his oeuvre. So I think it was something about both his color and his spirit, that there was this sort of dark quality or edgy quality to some of his subject matters, like the death of Sardanapalus or the massacre at Chios, But actually there has been quite a bit of study of his palette, and there was an exhibition, I want to say at the Philadelphia Museum in the 90s, and they had his palette for the exhibition, and I know they've done some technical studies on it. And if you go to the Musée Delacroix in Paris, which is great, it's a tiny jewel-like museum, they have at least one of his palettes there. So you can actually see it, and there are still pigments on it, so you get a sense of what they look like now. How they've aged over time, I'm not entirely sure, but there definitely have been interesting analyses of his palette. Thank you all.
Now, of course, we can take a million photos. I'm actually not like that. I'm quite a snapper, and then I leave it. And I actually like the happy accident part of photographs.